Hi, I'm Lexington, and for today's Lexington, we're gonna Lexington all about the Lexington, and Lexington we go over the Lexington and see what talents the Lexington should Lexington, and just Lexington. And actually this video can be super short, as the big question, of course, is how does the Lexington make the AR landscape look just after I made the other AR video, and I'm totally not mad about that. Totally not mad. Is the Lexington the best in everything? As far as high-end ARs go, yes. And that is basically the video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye. Why are we still going? Do I have to do a whole thing? Fine, we'll do a whole thing. Hi, I'm IKEA, and we're gonna look at the Lexington. And to compare the Lexington, the veteran reward we just got, it is, of course, has been added to the burst and sustain tables. As we can kind of see right away, it is the top burster, not by a country mile or anything. It is just above the F2000. We can actually kind of zoom in a little bit, which is this one. We can see that it is just above the F2000, but it doesn't have the downside of the F2000. You got to remember that, as we discussed in the AR comparison video, which this is basically an addendum to, so definitely go watch that kind of as well. Although a lot of it is kind of become outdated because of the Lexington, annoyingly. But the talent section of that is still the way to kind of go with it. What we saw is that the F2000 kind of lands around, when we put it actually on a build, it actually, on a striker at least, falls just behind the FAMAS. They're just right next door to each other. And that's because of this -1 mod, of course. The F2000 has 1 mod slot less for crit chance or crit damage. And that, of course, eats into its damage and pushes it down. Same for the Handy Badger and such. So the real top weapon here, as we kind of saw there, was the FAMAS. And the FAMAS is basically 2.7% behind the Lexington. The way that the Lexington is actually set up for its damage stats, not per se also its handling and such, it isn't a direct copy of the M4, as I keep seeing people say over and over again. And a lot of that is due to its recoil pattern, which is completely different. The Lexington is the M4's base damage and RPM and max size and also reload. But then the base damage is plus 5%. Now, some have said they did this with the Harvest and it's fine, and they did it with the Harvest and it was kind of fine. Although in the end, and now, because the original Harvest was plus 20% weapon damage, this one is now plus 10. But also that came with a downside. Even originally, even in a weapon that, like, where we don't really care about the RPM anyway, we're going to use it as a headhunter tool, a determined tool, basically. There it had a downside of minus 18 RPM, starting out 18% RPM. Now it's minus 9% RPM. The Lexington is just getting a plus base damage. No losses to the RPM. This means that, yeah, it will top out the burst chart here, and by a decent margin. Basically, yeah, the M4 was like 2% behind the FAMAS, and now this Lexington basically leapfrogs it and goes to being 2 and a bit % in front of it, making it overall the very best pick. And not just for burst DPS, because this was the thing, as we kind of talked about with the other list, even without going into the full AR list, even here. What we really want is a high burst weapon, and preferably for its other attributes, especially its sustain as well, to not be horrible. And as we scroll up, the FAMAS is down here in sustain. The Lexington is much higher than it in sustain, mostly because the M4 was already above the FAMAS in sustain. So, of course, one with 5% more base is gonna perform a lot better than the M4 was. And this makes the Lexington the obvious pick. because also it doesn't have any issues with damage per mag. It is kind of the middle of the pack, but it is a high RPM-ish 50-round weapon. So yeah, it's still as well, for instance, better than the FAMAS here. And then, of course, the nail in the coffin is that it actually handles really well. It isn't the exact model of the M4. We'll kind of look at that after we look at the damage numbers here, because it pulls straight up, where the M4 has a up and to the right pull, where most weapons actually have that as well. It's also not exactly the Carbine 7 or such. To me, what it really feels like accuracy-wise is, it feels accuracy-wise, so the spread around the center dot, kind of like a Carbine. It's a little bit worse than M4, I feel, although that might just be, you know, me seeing into things. And then it has basically the pull up, the same amount as M4, but it doesn't have the pull to the right, basically, of M4. And it has decent reloads and does everything pretty well. And all of that together leads to it when we actually go to the AR version, which has been updated, and here as well, we have added in the Lexington. We can kind of see that in every category, the Lexington will be the top one, basically. It's the top sadist, it's the top killer then, and then the top measured, and then the top flatline, the top ranger, top strained, and top optimist, and top top just on top. It's on top and living large, even the top fast hands, of course. And that makes it so that basically overall the Lexington is best in slot. It's been which kind of annoys me. Overall, we had actually a little bit of balance, especially in the AR category. The last video kind of ended with you can go with an FAMAS, you can go with a Fault, you can go with a F2000, you can kind of go with even a Carbine 7 for the faster reloads and such. There was, and even also, yeah, the CTAR was a decent pick overall. Now it's basically just Lexington. If you're using a high-end AR, you should be using your Lexington as long as you have one. The only reason basically to not use it is that you don't have it, right? Now, of course, they at least fixed it now that everybody that is around now has one. But we have no idea actually how the Lexington is going to work going forward. Is it basically every Christmas, whoever is around, they're going to hand one out? Is that going to be the thing? Is it? So we kind of need clarity there as well, because same with the harvest, it was kind of unclear there if it was just like a one-time thing, which in the end it wasn't, but could have been. And they shouldn't do those kind of things, because now, yeah, for instance, on the build collection, I'm going to put a lot of Lexingtons on there. People starting in a month will not have access to the Lexington. So that just feels bad for them, and you just gave the veterans a 5% advantage over newer players, which is like, watch points already did that. Why are we adding to that issue, basically? That also led me to, the Lexington is not just a best in slot for the AR. We had to make one of these again for those that hadn't seen the Elmo version of this a long time ago, which is at the end of the build collection. We already had Elmo version in the past after a certain YouTuber had told us that it's you don't need anything except an Elmo. So we made a build with nothing but Elmos all the way down. In this case, at least, there is some truth to it. It's Lexington's all the way down. And all the way up, especially. So this build being now dubbed the Lexi Bell, because, it's just, this the Southern Bell thing of it's a Lexi, so it's a Lexi Bell. Don't Google that, of course, or do. I'm not your real dad. You can do what you want. But yeah, if we could, we would run Lexi Bells in the Lexis in all of our slots, just to have all of those talents. Let's actually have a look through here, kind of marginally seeing as how far ahead the Lexington actually becomes. So if we kind of look at the sadist, this is of course then on build. This will also, as always, be linked down below. I should say down there. They'll be in the description. to this, and also the folder that contains all of the different versions of the burst and DPS tables and such. The Lexington with the Sadist is going to come in, and it's basically now our 0 point. So we're going to just take that as our 0 points instead of the FAMAS that used to be there. We can also actually see that is even as Sadist, it actually jumped over the Chameleon with the body active here by a tiny bit. But yeah, of course, again, Sadist, you can't have perfect uptime. We should always say this just to make this still complete, but it's in here just to illustrate basically a flat amp going into it. And yeah, Lexington is basically, we see that 2%, 2.5%, or even a little bit more ahead. And that's consistently going to be the thing. And of course, the FAMAS is a much more, it's much more of a beast to handle. It has much worse stability. It pulls up pretty high in comparison when you unload a mag of it. We are going to actually look at the accuracy a little bit in a second, specifically for the Lexington, seeing as we're just discussing one weapon. But yeah, the Lexington is just on the same talent, is going to be always ahead of basically any other high-end. So while we still have competition, again, just, chameleons, they can be pretty good in just general play. You do need to keep it stacked up. It works better, for instance, if you're doing short things instead of long things. For instance, in missions and stuff, you will keep it re-triggering. Basically, if you under 45 seconds kill everybody, it will reset back to full. That can be quite valuable. Strega, actually, solo play now is one of the top picks. Bighorn, which is a little bit lower down here, but is still one of the top picks because it is pretty easy to get those headshots in. And this is as well, we're reusing again the numbers as we did before, which is that at grade 27, 20% headshot and 60% DTA. If we even headshot more and try to go for more headshots, the Bighorn does even better. But then the thing with the Bighorn especially as well is that even without stacks, if we go find that here, even without stacks, it's doing pretty well. So it's not all the way down the list. It's still pretty high up even if you're not stacked. But yeah, on the high end, the story basically becomes the Lexington exceeds everything. It'll be basically the killer version of it is at the end of the Sadist list. We even have basically the measured version of a Lexington is the same damage as a FAMAS with killer active. Now, of course, killer active again is one of those that we kind of have to quantify for ourselves what we think the uptime will be, because killer, of course, is not just always active. You need to activate it. It needs a kill. Sometimes even that kill, for instance, if you're like doing the countdown hunters, killer is kind of a bad talent to have at that point, right? Because you're going to fight one hunter, you're going to kill him. It might trigger killer, and then like unless you're on the east side, like there is another hunter to kill. If you're on the west side, you're looking at a 20-30 second walk before your next engagement. So killer will be gone by then. But yeah, we kind of see the measured Lexington be next to the FAMAS with killer active. And yeah, this kind of makes it that the Lexington as well, for instance, in the game, as you may have seen, or even on that Lexi Bell picture, it's already, for me, gone to grade 25, basically instantly on multiple accounts. I'm not expecting them to alter this choice soonish, because yeah, they kind of put it out. They've kind of made their bed and we'll have to sleep in it. And it is kind of a downside. And one of the things as well is that there was always, as a balancing factor, the long rail. Weapons, Flatline used to be one of the better talents. Still is. It is still competitive. Not per se, as you can see here, for instance. It is below measured overall. But then this is an averaging out of measured, especially if you... this is basically always unloading fully, although the first half of measured is actually the better part. So you can actually even get a little bit more just by not actually reaching the end continuously. But Flatline used to be an unbalancing factor, basically. And actually, Flatline at this point could use a buff to actually be that again. But it couldn't really be for ARs anymore that way because it used to be that some of the better weapons did not have a long rail. The Lexington does have a long rail. And as such, can take the linked laser pointer. So it basically has everything. It has good handling, the best damage of all the high-end ARs. And it has a long rail as well, even to boot. It is just better. Like the blurb at the start of this video of me just going, we can keep this short, and it's just better. It is. We can even see that actually, for instance, that's the last one we'll kind of point out here specifically is that the Lexington with fast hands is actually in the middle of some of the optimist weapons, although some of the worst bursters, because yeah, we're still just looking at burst here. We will go to sustain in a second as well. But for instance, yeah, the gap between, even though the FAMAS has a worse reload time, so it benefits more from fast hand, it doesn't actually catch up to it. I want to per se pick fast hands, again, general picks for talents, just to reiterate those, measured for general play, because it doesn't require anything outside of just firing. It just increases your damage quite a bit. Killer, especially solo, where you're not competing for the kills, Killer can be a really good pick. Then fast hands can still be a pick, just to, for me personally, it is not being caught in the reload as often, basically, because you often die while you're reloading. Although, yeah, the changes to fast hands make it less appealing than it used to be. Preservation can still be a good pick. A situation, of course, things like Future Perfect, Ranger as well can be a decent pick, especially if you're now using, for instance, By the Teeth quite a lot. Ranger can actually be one of the better picks for that, because if you're already going to be at 35 meters plus to trigger By the Teeth, not a bad choice, right? So yeah, let's actually go and look at the sustain as well, just briefly, and then we'll go into me ranting a little bit about balance. And let's continue on with the sustain end of things as well. As we saw actually in the main burst and sustain tables, the Lexington is halfway up, basically, making it kind of fit what the FAMAS used to be like pre-Project Resolve, why it was the top pick back then completely. And it was the top burster, and then it was decent enough on sustain as well. With the rebalance that they give us, a lot of weapons like the FAMAS actually got balanced to the point where they were, because of their reload speed especially being altered a little bit, they took the thing of, if it's good on burst, it's going to be horrible on sustain, and the other way around. Some of the better weapons on sustain will be some of the worst bursters. Overall, again, as always, in the vision, we lean much more towards burst DPS than we do towards sustain DPS. But we do want the sustain DPS to be there as well, if we have that pick, basically the opportunity cost wise. And the way it goes, again, as always, to see burst and sustain DPS. Burst is the top, the upper end of the theoretical damage. Sustain is the lower end. Basically, if you were to continuously fire into infinity, where would it flatten out to? And together, they're what we pick for our concept of min-maxing, because the thing with min-maxing, as we have quite often said recently, it's not only about the max, you also care about the min. It's min-maxing. It's not just maxing, it's min-maxing. So you want the min also to be as high as possible. And that is sustain in our world, basically, where it includes reload, basically. Burst does not account for reload or max size or things like that at all, and then we basically leave those out. But then those can be balancing factors, of course, because, for instance, in here we have the AUG that is a different max size. We'll see it a lot more in rifles and LMGs, where there is varying max sizes going around. Going to the Lexington now, though. We see that actually the Lexington with Sadist does not beat the TKB with Sadist here on sustain. But it's being right next door to it should give away that, seeing as it bursts so much higher than its upper line is so much higher than the TKB. and its lower line is just a little bit behind the TKB. So it's going to start higher, and basically the TKB would need a fight of like maybe into the 30 minutes. Well, actually not that much. You would need likely into the 40 to 50 mags expended for the TKB to actually beat the Lexington on basically its average line. And we see that kind of repeated again here as well. The Lexington, while in the sustain end, it isn't the top one. It is in the middle of some of the other things. For instance, here the fast hands next to the TKB again, which is the top sustainer overall. And it's competing well with them. It basically, yeah, again, has no downsides. And that's kind of the issue with it. It is basically the top pick. The only reason to not pick it is because you don't have it. And that's going to happen a lot. Now, of course, everybody has one. It's kind of in the same way as when the Harvest came out. We were all kind of fine with it for those weeks of just like, yeah, we get to have a better weapon for, and especially with the prospect then of the PTS changes and stuff that we knew back then, that the Harvest would be the top pistol for Determined, for instance, running pistol Determined, which was a popular build. But then the Harvest wasn't available, and everyone was like, oh, well, what? Yeah, now we have to take a 686. At least now the balance there is just 10%, not the 20% that it was started at. But here as well, in a few weeks, even now, if somebody buys the game now and logs in, do they get a level 1 Lexington? Do they get a veteran reward? Are they a veteran? What does veteran even mean in this case, right? Does this re-trigger next Christmas? Do they have to wait till then to get a Lexington? Because yeah, the Lexington, even though just because some of the exotics exist and we can at least steer people to those. It is just if you're going high end, and going high end is like, even for instance solo, I like going with a high end weapon even on strikers over even when solo versus a Strega or such, just so I can have a Scorpio secondary, because the Scorpio has a lot of value. So yeah, we'll kind of have to see how that aligns. We'll keep it short here on the sustain though, is that basically, yeah, it's always just behind the TKB basically, and a few of the other top sustainers when it comes to, when we, on each of the talents. But it is very high, and then we get this combination basically. It's a top burster, it's really good on sustain, and it doesn't have any other big flaws. Again, like it doesn't have a horrendous mag size, it doesn't have horrendous handling, and that will make it basically. So that's, this thing is basically, yeah, not per se in jest. It is, in fact, yeah. And we get to even have to, if we were to want to, and run doubles of them. Yeah, let's take this to a range for a second. I just want to discuss a little bit of its handling characteristics, and then we'll go into a rant. And let's briefly, yeah, kind of talk about handling here, which we generally don't talk about in, well, somewhat briefly. I just throw stuff out there about them in when talking about it in the DPS tables and stuff, because the DPS tables are just that. They're the DPS tables. I expect you to kind of know what the handling of different weapons are. But maybe I should give a brief introduction on how we quite often check for, especially recoil patterns, because the recoil patterns are quite different per weapon. The easiest way is to just, you lift up your mouse. If you have a mouse, if you're using a controller, you just don't touch the sticks, and you just go. I do this like a bunch of times because there's actually a little bit of variance in that. So for instance here, I'm gonna put it there, and yeah, on mouse lift up, of course, it kind of shifts a little bit. So yeah. But we can kind of see that's a recoil pattern of the FAMAS. Very although actually, so for instance, one thing to do as well is not per se do it on striker, which I should have realized that was on there. Let's grab this pesty build, which is definitely not made for this, but. And although as well, we'll teach this as a teaching moment. We'll put our starter there, mouse lift up, and that is 15 weapon handling difference. So for instance, as a comparison point, But we can kind of, yeah, that was the FAMAS. It goes, it lifts up quite high. Its accuracy, though, is decent, as we can kind of see until like its later rounds. It actually doesn't spread out as much. If we now go, for instance, to the Lexington, let's put the Lexi here. The Lexington is actually not a copy of any specific, or it is bugged in its side-to-side recoil, one of the two. But it basically pulls slightly to the left, even. But look at the difference in recoil compensation needed there. And we should only really look at the far right FAMAS one there. But yeah, it pulls a little to the left. It doesn't have much accuracy issues. If we kind of actually then compare this to the M4, and this is the reason as well, a lot of people are getting it's the exact copy of an M4. It's not, at least it's not exact. The thing is, the height of it, as you can see here, the M4 kind of pulls pretty heavily to the right. The height of it is kind of the same, but especially, yeah, the side-to-side recoil is much more left-leaning. Do that again. You actually see that, yeah, you kind of have inconsistency quite often between two. May have compensated a little. Actually, I lifted up kind of instantly. But yeah, you have the M4 kind of going straight up a little bit and then to the right. You also have a lot of these kinds of things with weapons where they have where their recoil kind of shifts halfway through the mag. It's also not exactly, for instance, a carbine 7, which is, you know, a similar weapon. So just gonna put it there. But yeah, we have kind of similar recoil patterns there. So for instance, as well, what we have is the AKs, which pull to the left actually as well. And the AKs, of course, have much bigger bloom to them. I'm not doing a perfect test here. This is just, you know, I don't know what distance I was at before, but this, for instance, AK, it pulls to the left, kind of, and then kind of goes straight up. And yeah, that is the difference, for instance, as well, between the AK and a FAMAS, and then the Lexington and the M4 and the carbine. The Lexington has no issues here. That's kind of the thing as well. It is competing to some of the burst weapons because, for instance, as well, the F2000, as we kind of saw, as being one of the burst weapons, it still has quite the pull up. It is basically the same as the FAMAS, even a little bit more. Although, of course, again, as we kind of saw, strikers will kind of even it out a little bit just because of its weapon handling. But the Lexington feels pretty good. On the accuracy end of it, so how many of the shots go kind of to the center, I feel it's not as good as the M4, as directly comparable as the M4. It feels a little bit more like the Carbine 7, which is also good, was also always good at its accuracy. But yeah, but there's basically no downsides to this thing. That's the lesson we want to kind of take away from here. Yeah, let's actually go to a final segment here where I kind of want to talk about balance and why it kind of matters. And lastly, yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about my gripes with this, because for a lot of people, I feel the tone has been, oh, we got a new OP weapon, yay! And I'm not going to begrudge you that if that's the way you want to think about things. But I will begrudge the devs for putting this in after they kind of balanced the ARs. The thing was, before the Lexington came in, as we already kind of did the AR video, the AR list there was a lot of picks in there. FAMAS was good, F2000 was good, CTAR was good as like just bursters. Fall was good as a decent burster with ammo conservation, but like lower RPM, so you kind of had to consider that. Then we had this Carbine 7, which was a good reloader, gave out a little bit more burst, but was pretty handleable. Same for the M4. It had a bit better burst than the Carbine, but gave up a little bit on the sustain end because it had longer reload than the Carbine. Those had long rails with the Fall as well, so if you need a long rail, it was basically also Kingbreaker kind of makes sense because that did be pretty close to everything else. Now the answer to that all is basically, if you have the Lexington, use the Lexington. And that to me is boring, at the very least. At the very least, it's that issue. Where just because one thing exists that overshadows everything else, we kind of need to use that instead of the variety. Now, of course, here it's a weapon. It's an AR. It's just competing with all the other ARs, especially the high-ends. The exotics do other things. But we've had the same issue, for instance, with Striker for the longest of whiles, where if you're going red build, you're basically going Striker, and then you're just playing Striker's thing. It really requires some either pushing or some just curiosity from the person themselves to kind of go play Umbra in the past. Although Umbra is now pretty good, or Heartbreaker in the past. Although again, Heartbreaker is now pretty good now that's been buffed, and Striker has been taken down a peg. Because it's kind of hard to go with the second choice. Why would you, right? You get to run one build at a time. Might as well make it the best build that it is. But we could have had some variety there, because I was still as well, swapping between M4s and FAMASs kind of before the Lexington came in. Because sometimes you just don't want to do all of the recoil compensation needed for F2000 or a FAMAS. And then, for instance, actually, CTAR was one of my go-tos recently. All of that kind of gets bypassed by just this one singular weapon being so good as it is. When you have a best in slot, that kind of takes away all other options in that slot. At least in this case for high-end ARs. We had the same, of course, with Fox's Prayer, basically. But then Fox's Prayer was at least just one piece in a build, and then it wasn't, basically, when Striker became the meta, and we shifted away from high-end reds. We still have other places where, there is, like, same here, for instance, with Detox third stat, where I was hoping they would, if they're going to do mods, they should have done rebalancing of the third stats as well. We have basically one pick in there. And that also causes one big issue, is that you have to have the weapon, for instance, when we talk about Detox, you need that third stat to become Detox or be Detox. That means that a lot of weapons that would be viable, when a guard rule drops and it's with DTA and just some silly talent, I'm just going to toss it, right? If that's the way it comes, I'm just going to toss it out. If those were competitive, that would actually cut down on grinding, because if the DTA, the DTH, rate of fire version of a AR, all of them were kind of competitive, that would make it possible to get a version with, for instance, if rate of fire was maybe like 8% or something. I'm just throwing a number out there, but a much more competitive number. Then if I get once I get a drop of a FAMAS or something with a rate of fire or something, I'll still feel good about it instead of, oh shit, it's not Detox, I'm going to toss it. And now that's the same here as well. Why would I care about any weapon drop recently when basically, if I get a guard rolled Carbine 7 or something, or a guard roll, whatever's, as many guard rolls in here exist, multiple FAMAS's guard rolled. This one is not even recalibrated yet. Why should I care about these? And that diminishes just the variety, and then also just the amount of usable items. Because once you have a Lexington, that kind of fixes that. But then now as well, what they've done is actually, of course, we got one, and there were some issues with it. Then they give out a second one at least to fix the issues for the people that didn't get their first one. I'm giving my second one here in the mailbox. I'm just going to let it live there because one is enough for me. And the reason for that as well is on this main account, on my second and third account, I use one character basically as the main character. Here, I'm using 4 characters. That's actually going to be the balancing factor for the Lexington for me, because this thing is going to go into the stash, and 9 times out of 10, I'm going to forget to pull this thing out of the stash before I go do something, and then I'll just run whatever weapons that character has on them, like a FAMAS or something similar. But that's not a really good way to balance your game. Because currently, basically, with the way that it's standing. And what kind of pisses me off as well, again, about it is just that they just balanced the damn ARs, and then they bring this out. I even, on the stream that it was on, on the day that Lexington got released basically to us, they had a stream. I basically asked the question out, and some people helped me by spamming it to get it answered, basically. It's just that, hey, don't you guys feel this is undoing your recent balancing? And I feel basically what it should have had as a balancing factor is the same as the Harvest, which is basically less RPM. If you're giving it more base damage, just, you know, +5, -4, it would still been one of the best bursters in that category. It would have been like next, because you're still gaining. So unless you're doing +5, -5, which will end up at the same spot kind of. But if you're doing +5, -4, which is kind of in line with the +10, -9 of the Harvest, +10 base damage and then -9 RPM of the Harvest, it would have still been a really good weapon. But now what it basically is like just, right? Like, the kind of feel like, why would I even, why would we even? Like, if you have the Lexington, what is the purpose of all of these? And that is my issue with it, because a lot of people go like, oh, you just want nerfs, and who's going to complain? The NPCs, are the NPCs going to complain? No, we complain. We should complain. Balance is a good thing. Having variety, having, you know, getting some guns and not having been tied to just having to need the Lexington basically to compete, that is just a bad way to balance it. It is horrendous a way to balance it. This one has actually pissed me off much more than, because I was in favor of seasonal characters. I'm in favor of the modifier, for instance, as well. The seasonal XP thing, yeah, I'm kind of against as well with most people. But yeah, when you devalue everything else of this, that doesn't really help your game, because now you're kind of locking everybody into a singular choice when it comes to high-end ARs. Luckily for them, they made a lot of the ARs, exotic ARs, actually overpowered, so those at least compete, and that will give choices as well to people that will not have this weapon. Especially, for instance, as well, in places where you definitely would use something like Flatline or something like a Heartbreaker Tech Tank or something. Lexington is just so much of a better choice than really anything else. So yeah, that just to kind of talk about balance and why it does matter, why it's not just being grumpy for being grumpy. No, and it's not just the NPCs that will complain. We should be complaining. We would want balance, because balance gives you variety. If only one choice only exists, that takes away all of the other choices, especially now that they actually had done a decent job with the high-ends. I don't think this will get changed at all. I think this will just be an issue for us to deal with. Kind of like the Oreo was for the longest of time, but then Oreo got changed, so maybe not the best comparison. But yeah, the Lexington has come in, and to kind of conclude this video, it is objectively the best high-end AR. It just doesn't have any of the downsides needed to kind of balance it out in any way, especially when we're kind of talking about it being honestly just a 5% better M4. And that is basically a 2.5 times or 2.5% better than a FAMAS, which is a much more hard to handle weapon. When we see it basically top all of the high-end parts of this, high-end AR-wise, it's the Lexingtons. It's Lexingtons all the way down. It is so best in slot that we slot it into the best slots. We have the best slots, and we slot in the best in of those slots, and just everything Lexi. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video or found it informative, or kind of enjoyed me hating myself a little bit, yeah, then if you can do any and all of the algorithm stuff down below, that would be much appreciated. For the next videos, we're going to go into LMGs. The LMG list is completed. It is ready to be turned into video, which is likely going to happen next week. In between as well, I will likely put out a watch alt video, as I'll work on that a little bit as well. And then, of course, further in the future, the rifle list is getting started on. SMG, of course, came out a few days ago. So yeah, go and check those out if you're interested in them, and we'll come back in a few days with the LMG one, definitely. So yeah, we'll end it off there. I thank you for joining me, and as always, have a good night.